Cobb Gang!
What up, chuds? Cobson here, back with another brand new video. Today we're going to talk about the grand old Republican Party. While it has been unfairly maligned by the left-wing mainstream media, the GOP is the party for broadly right-of-center voters. It holds an array of positions that go from center-left classical liberalism all the way to right-wing populism. With such a big tent, defining the party's positions can be rather tough. This is especially the case when Republican politicians campaign on platforms that are much more to the right relative to where they govern and vote when elected. So I think it's important that before we go into the party's various factions, we need to talk about a certain type of person who is hated by everyone else within the party, but for some reason is adamant on staying here. That person being the rhino. However, to determine who a rhino is, we must come up with some criteria. I propose that elected Republicans have 3 commitments that they must honor to maintain their long-term political future and standing with their constituents. The first is the commitment to the constituency. Your job as an elected Republican is to work as hard as you can to better the lives of your voters and govern in a fashion that reflects their right-of-center beliefs. The second is a commitment to ideology. As a Republican, you must uphold a certain standard of right-wing belief, especially if you're in a seat with at least a sizable Republican partisan lean. There is no need to vote like you represent Massachusetts if you actually represent Utah. The third commitment is a commitment to the team. You don't have to be a superstar firebrand like Josh Hawley, but if you can provide support when you're leaned on and don't outwardly obstruct our work or hand Democrats legislative victory after legislative victory, no one will have a problem with you. These 3 commitments are weighted in the order in which they were described. So let's look at some examples. With Senator Susan Collins, we see a pro-choice record with a vote to convict President Trump. It sounds awful, sure, but when you realize that she's representing Maine in the Senate, I'm willing to give her more leniency. Now, I'm not saying that it is acceptable in any way, shape, or form to have voted to convict for either impeachment trial, but Collins has shown a willingness to help us out with critical votes like Trump Supreme Court justices. As a result, I think Collins is still a real Republican, just one that has to win a state that votes 3 points to the left of the country as a whole. Contrasting with Collins, we have Lisa Murkowski. Murkowski has a similar shoddy record, except she's even worse. Murkowski is a complete train wreck. At least Susan Collins is a protectionist, she opposes affirmative action, and she's even good on immigration and guns. Murkowski, on the other hand, has no redeeming qualities. She's an awful, nasty woman who is actively betraying her constituency, being elected because of her ability to lobby the Alaska legislature to change election laws so Democrats could send their votes to her. Murkowski is as bad as they come in Washington, and I believe it is more than justified to give her the label of rhino. With that out of the way, let's talk about the different wings of the Republican Party. Starting with the leftmost group, we have the Rockefeller Republicans. These guys are somewhat fiscally conservative and left of center on social issues. They're found all over the liberal Northeast, as it's the only region that will consistently elect them. Rockefeller Republicans are separated into 2 sub-factions, the team players and the sellouts. The major difference between the two is how each sub-faction interacts with the greater GOP. Despite holding virtually the same set of beliefs, Scott Brown and Phil Scott are viewed completely different in the eyes of the base. Scott Brown, as liberal as he is still interested in the long-term growth of the GOP and the greater right-wing movement. Phil Scott is literally indistinguishable from a Democrat and unironically voted for Joe Biden. If Scott Brown were still representing Massachusetts in the Senate, he'd probably still be well-liked among the Republican base because he's in it for more than just himself. If Phil Scott somehow won a Senate race, I wouldn't be surprised if he switched parties upon inauguration. Rockefeller Republicans are the Democrats' favorite Republicans because they have a massive amount of overlap with Democrats on a lot of the issues that really matter to us. I hesitate to call all Rockefeller Republicans rhinos because I understand you have to do something in order to be elected. But if you're like a Phil Scott type who just outright supported Joe Biden, the hell with you. Next up are the old guard Republicans. These are old-fashioned people in their approaches to governance. They're less than popular among the Republican voter base, but they have a ton of corporate backing behind them, which is why they keep winning elections. Old guard Republicans prefer to govern more than anything else, just looking to shore up stability and keep things running, oftentimes to the frustration of the base who want something done about the consistent leftward shift in American politics that has happened over the last 60 years. The Old Guard has two sub-factions, the Southern Establishment and the corporate GOP. The Southern Establishment is a group of Republicans from the South, most of whom have been in office for a long time. People like John Cornyn of Texas, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Tim Scott of South Carolina, and John Boozman of Arkansas all fit into this category as Southern Republicans with long, underwhelming records, especially given how conservative the respective states are. In contrast with the Southern Establishment is the corporate GOP. Corporate Republicans are some of the most corrupt politicians in the country. This faction of the GOP is best exemplified in our abysmal Senate leader, Mitch McConnell. In about 20 years, this faction will likely be far less powerful unless they're smart enough to groom successors and retire before they hit their 90s so that they can keep their style of governments going. Overall, the Old Guard, similarly to the Rockefeller Republicans, is not very emblematic of the priorities of Republican voters, and likely only win because they have an R next to their name. Moving on, moderate Republicans are, well, they are as they say on the tin. They're Republicans who are a bit to the left of the median Republican. Not to be confused with a rhino, a moderate Republican is someone who's genuinely principled but who also happens to represent a competitive district. Moderate Republicans have two sub-factions, the pragmatic right and the true moderate. Pragmatic right Republicans are Republicans who take a significantly less right-wing course of government but still hold their beliefs. The best example of this faction is Congressman Mike Garcia. Garcia represents a Biden plus 12 district and does an excellent job of furthering the goals of the right. He has a solid voting record, and when you adjust his record for the partisan lean of the district he represents, he becomes a contender for the title of Best Republican Congressman. Contrasting with the pragmatic right is the true moderates. True moderates represent light red or battleground districts, and they act the part. A good example of a true moderate is Representative Jeff Van Drew. Although he has a strong bipartisan streak, Van Drew has never thrown the conservative movement overboard and appears genuinely interested in representing his constituency as accurately as possible. Held in a similar vein to the moderates are the Libertarians. Libertarian Republicans are a very large tent in and of themselves, and they're interesting people with their own ideas, and sometimes they'll fit well in the GOP coalition, other times not so much. Libertarian Republicans have three variants: the Libertarians, Conservatarians, and Ron Paul Libertarians. Libertarians are just Democrats who didn't flunk out of basic economics. This is a specific libertarian-infused flavor of rhino that is best shown in former governor of Massachusetts, Bill Weld. This group also includes figures such as Gary Johnson and even Chase Oliver, if you want to really stretch the definition. Conservatarians are regular libertarians with a conservative outlook. They like small government and were elevated primarily by the Tea Party wave of 2010. Examples of current conservatarians include Governor Chris Sununu of New Hampshire and Mick Mulvaney. Finally, we have the Ron Paul libertarians, who take from none other than Ron Paul. These people hold rather interesting views on things like Social Security and the role of government. They tend to be very ideologically inclined individuals, and it shows. Examples of Ron Paul libertarians include Rand and Ron Paul, as well as Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Going on the opposite side of the continuum between authoritarian and libertarian are the neocons. Owing their existence to none other than Lev Trotsky, we have the neoconservative movement. Created as a way to bridge the gap between more fiscally conservative Republicans, Cold War liberals, and more internationalistic Rockefeller Republicans, Irving Kristol, along with his pals Ronald Reagan and Bill Buckley, took over the GOP in the late 70s and early 1980s and pushed it into an internationalistic, militaristic direction. Kristol believed that nationalism was the cause of anti-Semitism, so he fought as hard as he could in order to turn the United States' growing new right into the direction of neoconservatism so that he would not be swept up in the tides of a possible America First resurgence. I think it's impossible to separate neoconservatism from Judaism, given just how important Israel and its existence are to the neocons. Neoconservatism peaked twice, first during the Reagan administration and the second during the younger Bush's time in office. Both of these administrations were defined by a neglect of America's domestic issues in favor of a broader internationalistic stance in promoting liberal democracy in the interests of Israel. This belief system has broadly fallen out of favor with Republican voters as they view the failure of neoconservatism to actually help them on the issues they care about most, particularly economics and social issues. It also does not help that neocons refuse to be team players and support other factions, when it was them who relied on the votes of the entire GOP base to get themselves elected in the first place. The neocons can be split into the liberal internationalists, neo-libertarians, and religious Zionists. Liberal internationalists constitute a significant majority of neocons and include Bill Kristol, Nikki Haley, Lindsey Graham, literally every single politician with the surname Bush, and this one very special individual named Lulu Schwartz, who is fascinating. You should definitely search that person up. Liberal internationalists have a lot of friends in the Democratic Party, and many of them strongly supported Hillary in 2016 against Trump because of Clinton's excessively hawkish foreign policy. Neo-libertarians, on the other hand, are a group who, with the exception of war, are libertarian. They like cutting taxes and spending, but at the same time they want to bloat the military budget and, like all other neocons, are sexually attracted to the state of Israel. Notable neo-libertarians include Barry Goldwater, Ben Shapiro, and Paul Ryan. Finally, we have the religious Zionists, or the quote-unquote based neocons if you're retarded. These people can range from being just very socially conservative on the domestic front to being flat-out insane people who want to create an authoritarian government that is consistently at war with Arabs and forces you to read the Bible every night. On the moderate end, we have Senator Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania and Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. On the other extreme, we have Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas, who wants to use the military the moment there's any type of unrest. It was reasonable to call the military against the BLM rioters, but Cotton just wants to get rid of all of our freedoms. Moving on to the one faction even crazier than the neocons, we have the outer establishment. These figures blur the line between actual right-wing folks who support the base and real establishment shills who are even more manipulative than a normal establishment Republican. This faction is divided into two groups, the schizoids and the deficit hawks. The former is almost exclusively made out of high-maintenance white women such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and former Virginia State Senator Amanda Chase. These people have been theorized as being plants by either the federal government or the DNC to dumb down our discourse and provide a brush they can use to paint over the entire right. Similarly to the schizoids, the deficit hawks are very much opposed to taxes and spending, but they're not necessarily libertarian. They're still decently hawkish and they like to make some noise if they're ignored for too long. This group of people probably genuinely believes that government spending is by a rule negative. Prominent deficit hawks include Senators Ted Cruz and Ron Johnson of Texas and Wisconsin, respectively, as well as former Senator Jim DeMint. Following the outer establishment, we have the evangelicals, the only explicitly religious faction of the GOP that primarily appeals to voters of faith. This group can be split into the Christian populists and the Christian establishment, two groups that are at odds with each other. Starting with the Christian populists, we have a group who believe in a fusion of social and paternalistic conservatism. These individuals will support things that are seen as more economically leftward than their peers, such as farm subsidies, tariffs, and even some limited expansion of social services. Members of this specific subfaction include Governor Mike Huckabee of Arkansas and Senator Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania. As opposed to the Christian populists, the Christian establishment likes to wave around the Bible and will occasionally push for real socially conservative changes, but only if they have a strong legislative majority to do so. This group is more than happy to reinforce the status quo and keep the government running at the expense of their campaign promises, and even their own deep-held religious and personal beliefs. Members of the Christian establishment include former Vice President Mike Pence and former President George W. Bush. At last, certainly not least, we have the populists. Populist Republicans are a very diverse crowd when it comes to actual beliefs, with their primary unifying concerns being a strong opposition to immigration and a strong support for tariffs. These types of Republicans were elevated by the candidacy of President Trump in 2016, and they tend to be some of the party's most popular candidates among the base. populist Republicans can range from moderate populists like Mark Ronchetti and Roger Marshall to more socially conservative populists like Josh Hawley or J.D. Vance. Overall, I think it's safe to say that there are a lot of divisions within the GOP, and I think that this is actually a good thing for the party. It's always good when we're able to challenge each other on our differences and work together despite them. As I close out this video, I wanted to make sure that I did not mention any factions as being, quote, pro-Trump or, quote, anti-Trump. This is because I don't view Trump as a particularly ideological figure, but instead a strong campaigner who's more right than he's wrong. As for the Donald Trump issue, I will maintain that there's no stance on which anyone who is genuinely interested in conservative policy could use to justify not voting for Donald Trump. I understand you might be pro-life and dislike his moderate stance on abortion, or you're pro-gun and still pissed off that he banned bump stocks. These and many more are valid, principled Republican criticisms of President Trump and a testament that he is not the perfect candidate. On that same token, President Trump is still the best candidate for those issues, especially when the other options are progressives RFK Jr., Kamala Harris, Cornel West, Jill Stein, and Chase Oliver. I want to reiterate that it is perfectly acceptable to dislike Trump as a Republican. But if you are really so hung up on one or two petty things about the man's character, or just so upset that he won't ban abortion nationwide, that you decide to endorse someone like Kamala Harris, I recommend that you stop calling yourself a Republican. People such as myself have been willing to get behind candidates that are more establishment than we'd like Glenn Youngkin, and candidates that are further to the right than us on social issues like Ron DeSantis. If you can't take one for the team, then the team does not want you. As to the grifters such as Bill Weld, Lizard Cheney, and Adam Kinzinger, I want to say that they are not welcome within the party. If you claim to be conservative but then take every possible opportunity to attack our candidate and elevate another candidate who's objectively not even remotely close to being on the right, then you are not welcome within the GOP. No, I don't care about January 6th or him talking about government workers, because the former was vastly overblown and the latter is actually a good thing given how corrupt and broken our political system is. If you want to stick your neck out for international liberalism and the same far-left policies that you were happy to oppose when our candidates were Mitt Romney or John McCain, then you are not a serious Republican and should change your party ID to schizophrenic. Just because the tent is big doesn't mean you have the right to barge in and demand that we all change for your sake. If you are not a Republican, but interested in learning about right-of-center ideas, policy, and rhetoric, I highly recommend that you search up individuals such as Vince Stout, Tucker Carlson, Ubersoy, Mentis Wave, Actual Justice Warrior, Black Pigeon Speaks, Elect Right, Jesse Lee Peterson, Keith Woods, The Lotus Eaters, Paul Joseph Watson, Alex Stein, Mark Dice, and The Distributist. You might not know some or all of these names, and that's alright. While I do not endorse all their views, I feel like these people combined make up a cross-section of the emerging right and what the future of right-wing policy will look like. Thank you for watching this video. If this thing gets over 1,000 views, I'll consider making another big project of mine, this time on the 2012 election and how the Republican Party underperformed so badly. Without further ado, Cobson out.